We thank all of you here that are here today in person, and for those of you that are joining us online, a very warm welcome. My name is Carolyn Kissane. I'm the Assistant Dean here at the Center for Global Affairs. At the CGA, we have two graduate programs, the MS in Global Affairs and the MS in Global Security, Conflict and Cybercrime. We also have a robust array of continuing ed programs, and we host public events such as this one tonight. We are really privileged. We feel very privileged to have the opportunity to host this special event. We are doing this in partnership with the NYU Jordan Center for the Advanced Study of Russia. We thank Professor Josh Taylor for being with us tonight, the NYU Department of Russian and Slavic Studies, and the NYU Program in International Relations. So this is a collaborative event, and we have two very special guests who are joining us, not from Belarus, because they're currently living in Greece, but they are very much represent the movement for democracy in Belarus, and we're really delighted to have them with us tonight. And of course, today is also a very special day in the United States. It is Election Day. I hope that all of you that are here today that are eligible to vote have already voted. The polls, I think, will still be open until 9 p.m. So if you didn't get to it earlier today, you still have an opportunity afterwards. But I think the fact that we're today talking about not just the state of the war in Ukraine, but also sort of democracy writ large, I think it's quite appropriate that we're doing this on Election Day in the United States. So first, let me go ahead and introduce Valery Tsepkalo, who is, he has many different titles. First Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs from 1994 to 1997, the Ambassador of Belarus to the United States from 1997 to 2002, Director of the Belarusian High-Tech Park, and a candidate for the presidency of the Republic of Belarus in 2020. And I just want to highlight that Belarus has had one president since 1994, Alexander Lukashenko. So the election in 2020 that Valery participated in was a very, very important one. Unfortunately, Lukashenko did not recognize the democracy movement, and as has been recognized by Freedom House and many other organizations, that the elections were openly rigged. Civil liberties are extraordinarily restricted. And, we are grateful to have the opportunity to discuss not only what's happening in Belarus, but also in the larger region, with attention to, of course, the ongoing war in Ukraine. Valery is also joined by Veronica Tsepkalo, who is the head of the Belarus Women's Foundation. The Sakharov Prize, she received the Sakharov Prize for Freedom of Thought in 2020, and the Martin Luther Fearless Word Prize in 2021, and the Charlemagne Prize in 2022. So together they are a fearless force, and we really are delighted and grateful to have both of you with us tonight. After Valery's presentation, we're going to have a moderated panel. We have our own Professor Michael Oppenheimer, who is a clinical professor and head of our international relations global futures concentration here at the CGA, and has been at the CGA since it was launched in 2004. We also have a very, very special and dear friend of the Center for Global Affairs, Peter Clement, who is the interim director of the Arnold A. Saltzman Institute of War and Peace Studies, an adjunct professor at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs, and really just a wonderful thought leader on developments that are happening in Russia. And we also have Dr. Joshua Tucker, who's a professor of politics, director of the Jordan Center for the Advanced Study of Russia, co-director of the NYU Center for Social Media and Politics, and also an affiliated professor of Russian and Slavic Studies, a professor of data science. So you keep very busy, Josh. But right now I'm going to hand it over to Valery. So Valery, thank you so very much for being with us this evening.
Thank you very much for your introduction. Thank you, everybody, for having time to be with us tonight. So, well, just we arrived about 1 week ago to the United States of America, namely to North Carolina, to Charlotte, with the intention to visit the North Carolina Research Triangle. But, in order to talk about it, I think it would be the best auditorium, the best time when we will be able to get back to Belarus and to share the experience that your country has in technology development and biotech industry in particular. But unfortunately, we have to talk about another triangle that consists of Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus. And these three countries now are in focus of international attention, unfortunately, because we would probably like to consider and to learn something different, not the conflicts or wars that we have, and that potentially can influence not only the regional stability and security, but also the global security. So, just if we would return back a little bit to 2020, everyone in the Republic of Belarus in the world were able to see that Lukashenko didn't have any support among any social groups of Belarus people. So the only way for him to stay in power was to get a support from Kremlin, from Putin in particular, at the time when law enforcement people and military people in Belarus were hesitating, and many of them, in fact, gave their encouragement or gave their voice to endorse me and Viktor Babarika in particular to run for the president, and they left their signatures. And this was a very clear indication that these people really also wanted changes. And they were hesitating at the time. You remember when hundreds of thousands of Belarus people went to the streets, and at that time Putin publicly recognized Lukashenko as the winner, though he knew probably better than anyone else that Lukashenko had lost these elections. And he gave him 1.5 billion in cash to bribe probably law enforcement in order to take a side that Putin really wanted, because the biggest threat for him, the biggest fear for Putin, was the way how society can be changed. The biggest fear for him was just to imagine that it could be a democratic change in power through elections. And this was, and even the biggest fear for him was the events that took place in Ukraine in 2014, when they threw away a corrupted president and made the revolution. And this for Putin was a complete nightmare that he couldn't stand. Therefore, you have to understand at that time, Belarus military and Belarus law enforcement that considered two bosses. That was before elections. One was sitting in Minsk, and another was sitting in Kremlin. And in fact, they didn't mind, in fact, if even Belarus would lose its independence, because in this case, they could become the second biggest, the part of the second strongest army in the world. That at least the perception that they had at that time, and probably not only them, but the whole world had no idea what the Russian army looked like. So for Putin, it was just one of the very clear reasons why he entered this war is definitely, or was not definitely, the speculations around the so-called denazification when Ukraine publicly, openly chose the Jewish comedian to become their president, and he won in free and fair elections. And any speculations about Nazification or denazification definitely didn't have any sense. However, what he really wanted, he wanted to take a part of Ukrainian territory, probably the biggest part. He wanted to change the government inside the Ukraine. And at that time, everybody were talking that if Kremlin would be successful in its war against Ukraine, they would overtake Belarus, and they would attack Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, even despite the fact that they were a part of NATO. But Putin didn't care, so he thought that NATO probably would not stand for these two Baltic states as they were a part of the Soviet Union, like it happened in 1939 when these territories were taken by the Soviet Union. So this was the plan, just to unite the enclave that they have in the north of Baltics, the Kaliningrad or former Königsberg region, to the territory of Russia and to the territory via the territory of Belarus. However, these plans never fulfilled, and that was a good news. Now, what are the speculations? The major speculations is whether Belarus army will enter, or are there any chances that Belarus army will enter the territory of Ukraine? From my viewpoint, now it's absolutely impossible. It was very likely within the first 2 or 3 weeks after Russia attacked Ukraine, because Belarus army at that time, if Russia would be successful, Belarus army could become the so-called second echelon of attack against Ukraine, and that was really very likely scenario. But now the admiration towards Russian army was changed towards the admiration, even piety towards the Ukrainian army that is very well trained, and they really fight very professionally against much bigger Russian troops. So why in fact Belarus army would never enter? It's very clear now that Lukashenko, that used to stay on 3 pillars. The first pillar was his, let's say, neutral relations with the West. At that time, he had a dialogue with the West, and West, in fact, believed that it would be possible to negotiate with him and to keep him a part of Russia. Then he had negotiations, always had negotiations with Russia, and had friendly relations with these two countries, with this country. But what was most important for Lukashenko is that everybody inside Belarus and abroad thought that he had the third pillar is the support from the side of Belarus society. So now there is no support from the side of Belarus society, and everybody understands it pretty clearly. There is no dialogue from the side of the West. It's also very understandable, because I cannot imagine any Western politician that would start to talk to a person who, in fact, put more than 45,000 people into prison, a person who went through torturous killings and didn't open even one criminal charge against these facts, against those people who were responsible for that. So, you know, I think it would be completely it would completely compromise, discredit any Western politicians if they would start to talk to him. So the only pillar that he has is Putin regime. So why? In fact, if Putin would instruct to send the troops of Belarus troops to Ukraine, well, Lukashenko probably would not have any chances, but he has to send Belarus troops to Ukraine. And the only reason why he is not going to do that, in fact, two reasons, because there are two possible scenarios. The first possible scenario is that Belarus army would give up immediately to Ukrainian army, to Ukrainian forces. The second is that they can turn weapons instead of south, they will turn it to the north against the regime that sits in Minsk in Belarus. And this scenario is also very clear because you know that today we have 2 years, 2.5 years, in fact, since the time when presidential elections were reached. And Belarus army consists of those people who were protesting against reached elections in 2020. Now they're completely different people serving in the army. We do not say about the officers, you know, just probably they were 2 years ago inside Belarus army, but because we have, well, just all of Belarusians have to serve in the army, I mean, all male Belarusians. Now in 1.5 years, just the infantry and the personnel is completely different. So now we are having different army, and you know, he cannot trust this army anymore. So this is the reason why Belarus is not entering Ukraine. In fact, several reasons. In fact, but still, Ukraine has to keep its army, its military units to the north of the country, and because you know, still it's pretty uncertain. Russian troops are inside the territory. However, there is one more reason why Belarus would probably never enter the territory of Ukraine. Just imagine for a moment that Putin would not speculate about this denazification and demilitarization. But if Putin would say, look, guys, we go to Ukraine because we would like to get land from there. We would like just to occupy part of their territory and make this part of territory a part of Russian Federation. You know, it probably would not change anything. But for Belarusians, you know, just what Belarus can achieve. Russia at least can get a certain portion of Ukrainian territory and attach it towards its territory, but the same way as they did in connection with Crimea. But what they can do, what Belarusians can achieve, in fact, if they would move to the south, they can get either the wetland in the west, you know, wetland that the only real resource that you can get is cranberries that you can collect on a wetland. And to the east of Belarus, we can get the very significant part of the territory that was under the Chernobyl disaster. You know, the Chernobyl power station and the territory that was affected by the Chernobyl disaster. So we have no idea what to do with our territories that were affected by Chernobyl. So, you know, just it would be another burden for Belarusians. So, you know, just there is nothing that Belarus can achieve in terms of territorial gains, in fact, if they would enter Ukrainian territory. So thank you just for this introduction. I will be more than happy to answer the questions if you have. And well, since, you know, we feel the pulse of this, in fact, relations in this, unfortunately, triangle, and not the research triangle, not a creative triangle. However, and well, just I would be more than happy to share my thoughts about it. Thank you.
Thanks very much. That's a great start to this. You guys want to come up and have a seat? So just one question for you, Valerie. Extend what you've already said. It doesn't appear that Lukashenko is going to be of much help to Putin in prosecuting his war in Ukraine, other than holding down a few Ukrainian troops along that border. Is that a safe assumption for the United States to make, or would you like to, or have you observed a dialogue between the United States and Lukashenko, in which the United States has made it clear that there would be negative consequences if he intervened or allowed his territory to be used once again as a launching pad for a second front by the Russians?
I personally think there is no need to say anything like that in public or in private or tete-a-tete. It's very clearly understandable for everyone. And, just at this moment, Belarus still is not under the same sanctions as the Russian Federation. But everybody understands that for Belarus, it would be a complete disaster if they would enter the war, because Russians, they can substitute these sanctions with the oil and the gas and some ferrous and non-ferrous metals, that they possess in huge numbers, and just they are not dependent on technology. In fact, that, and their export is 90% dependent on natural resources, on commodities that have a value, and that they are not affected by sanctions. But in terms of Belarus, I think it would be a complete disaster.
So his position obviously is not an enviable one. What's the end game for Lukashenko? And he's backing, at least rhetorically, a country that's losing a war on its borders, and he himself is an illegitimate authoritarian leader. How does his own position evolve over the next couple, 3 years? Is he a wasting asset, or does he have options to stay in power? What do you think?
Well, at least, definitely his fate is very dependent on the future of Putin, and that's very clearly. And I personally think that Putin will not be able to survive 2024 for certain reasons, many reasons, but even the historical precedents of the Russian empire showed that they lost in the war, even if it's a local loss, brought to very significant changes inside Russia. For instance, we can recall the loss in the Crimean War to Britain and France, which led to the abolition of serfdom because of the very active movement among the peasantry in Russia. Then the loss to a Japanese fleet in 1905. It resulted in 2 years of revolution, and then the reforms that was launched by Stolypin, in fact, copy-paste from Abraham Lincoln's Homestead Act. It's really very, very close in time, even 5 years of this period, just when you can start working on the land and when you would become a landowner. And then the loss in the First World War also resulted in the democratic revolution and then the socialist coup. But I think that that by 1 year after today, they have to launch the presidential campaign in Russia. And the challenge for Putin will not be the people that from liberal or nationalistic opposition, because they know, the same way as in Belarus, they know how to marginalize them. just normally what they say, look, just these people, liberals, they do not have any managerial experience, just they live on grants, and so on and so forth. So, just they cannot be a real statesman in their understanding. But if the challenge would come from inside, the same way as in 2020, it happened in Belarus, just then what they can say. They can definitely take us off the race and what they did. But in fact, what I think will happen in 2023, at the end of 2023, Putin's regime will be challenged by the people whom we all know very well, but we have no idea that they have intentions to run. And they will be the biggest challenge for the Putin's power, because it's quite understandable that there is no success in this war, and whatever you portray it, just people would not believe that you won this war. As one just small remark, the strange war of China against Vietnam. Just nobody understood why, in fact, China did that. They entered in 1978 to Vietnam. They moved approximately the same, like a couple of hundred kilometers. And, just they also organized Buchas and Irpin, just they were two places that Chinese soldiers, they acted very brutally in connection to Vietnamese civilians, the same way as Russians did towards Ukrainian civilians. And then they retreated. And nobody, in fact, understood why in fact, what was the reason behind it. And I think that, just the most clear reason, and I think that it makes sense, was that in China, they had a collective decision-making process. And Deng Xiaoping wanted to demonstrate to the whole members of the Politburo that didn't want any changes inside China, that even the largest army in the world is very weak when the country is not modernized. And they retreated, and then Deng Xiaoping started in next year. He started his reforms that made China now the second power in the world. So I don't think that Putin had to do something similar. He just wanted to be reelected the same way as he succeeded in 2014, just when they attached Crimea, annexed Crimea, and just he was like a winner, and he won, in fact, the public support in Russia. So he wanted to repeat the same story, but as Heraclit said, you cannot enter twice to the same river. So this time he failed.
One more question on Belarus. The extent of opposition to Lukashenko, internally as well as externally. Internally it looks as if he has absolute power, but are there indications of resistance within the country? And would you describe for us the nature of external Belarusian resistance to Lukashenko?
Very good question. Thank you. Thank you very much, first of all, for bringing the Belarus, in the focus, because we know this terrifying war in Ukraine put us, behind what's happening in the world. So, 2 years ago, I created the Belarus Women's Foundation. We founded the Belarus Women's Foundation, and we work with the people who are in repercussions in Belarus. And the level of the repercussions is very, very scary. What's happening in Belarus, there were almost 1,700 political prisoners. 2 years ago, it was only 50. Now it's 1,700. And this number increases every single day. And out of this number, we have 202 women, female political prisoners, and 225 more women who are, under Russian house arrest. The women are very, the women and men, both civilians, are very repressed now in Belarus. You need to understand the level of repressions. You are put into prison only for wearing red and white colors, which are our historical colors. For this, you are put in prison. For even a comment in social media, you will go to prison. for putting a candle in the window, you know, in a memory of those who killed, you know, in prison. So there is no democracy whatsoever in the country, and the people are penalized for absolutely nothing with a very high fines. And you know, because in Belarus we have still the salary, monthly salary is not more than $500 in Belarus. People, when you penalize them $4,000 or $3,000. I mean, it's impossible for people to survive and feed the families. That's why no, the resistance inside of the country is still there. People are just very, you know, like not scared, but they're impressed. What's happening inside of the prisons is horrifying as well, because as I said, I worked with them and with the women who was relieved from the prisons, you know, and it's scary because you're put in special cells with no windows, with no TV, with no bed, sheets, with nothing. I mean, you are staying there in the cell by yourself for 30, 60 days, etc. You are not allowed to go out, you know, just my work, you're not allowed to talk to anyone. My friend Maria Kalisnik was in this presidential campaign, we gave our support to Ivana Tsikhanouskaya together with Maria Kalisnik. She was sentenced to 12 years in prison only for taking part in the elections, the presidential elections. So what's is taken granted here in the United States, for us, it's a big issue. For us, it's a fight. For us, it's a matter of life, matter of freedom. You know, the people of Belarus who sacrificed everything just to live in a different country. That's why, like, inside the country, people are. Lukashenko doesn't have any support inside the country, because if you have a family member, a relative, a co-worker who got repressed only for, you know, taking part in peaceful protests, only for living economic and social media, only because you said you were vocal during the elections and you are put in the prison. What are you talking about? And what are the country we're living in? So we need to keep in mind also that approximately, nobody knows for sure, but approximately 10% of the population went Belarus because of the repressions inside the country. So basically what we're handling now is the lack of specialists, lack of professionals, doctors, you know, engineers, everybody who had the you know, degree educated to leave the country for their own safety, for the safety of their loved ones. Therefore, the situation in the country is very, very deteriorating. The situation is getting worse, and we just, the future of our country, for the people who are staying in the prisons, we understand we should not give up our fight, and we understand at the same time when Putin loses the war in Ukraine, it means Lukashenko will lose his power in Belarus. And it gives us, you know, the hope. It gives us the strength to continue our fight for the future of our people who were in prisons illegally in Belarus.
Thank you. To just one small comment, if you allow, if you know, just anything would happen, it just, you know, its pressure is very high. So the hatred towards this regime did not disappear. And if the changes would be something, I think something happened similar to what happened in Tunisia, you know, just when some small course and everything blew up. And this is one thing. And another is that they were very active speculations that one of the reasons why Putin started this war was that Lukashenko provoked him. You know, just he said many times that, you know, just you could enter Ukraine and in 3 days you would be in Kiev. In 1 month you can come to the English Channel, to La Manche. And simultaneously he gave interview to Ukrainian media saying that no one soldier would enter from the territory of Belarus to the Ukrainian territory. And he swore to Ukrainians, you know, just with one very clear reason he did that. You know, he wanted to distract attention from Belarus, that because the global attention was towards him to somewhere else. And he was right. I mean, you know, just from this viewpoint, he, you know, if this was the case, then he succeeded, because the overall global attention now definitely changed to the situation in Ukraine.
Peter, I want to get to the Russians and what they're up to in Ukraine. lots of speculation about Putin's goals initially, how they've evolved, possibly broadened. What was your evaluation of his objectives, 10, 11 months ago? Do you think his objectives have changed? Have they inflated? Have they become more restrained?
Sure. A long question with a long answer, but I'll try to read brief. So I've long been wary of Putin's thinking about Ukraine. He's had a strong interest in Ukraine for as long as I can remember, but certainly starting at least in 2004, with the election that had to be recalled that led to the rise of Yushchenko. In the more recent past, the core question here is why did he invade Ukraine? And I'm not counting 2014 right now. 2014 happened, it was a success, it was pretty easy in my view. But this, personally, I thought this was shocking that a man who in the past had been so pragmatic and realistic about his foreign interventions, and I could rattle them off, but the obvious one would be Georgia in 2008, Crimea in 2014, Syria in 2015, very little ground forces, very little risk, potentially high gains, very successful. And then all of a sudden, we put 160 to 180,000 troops on the border and threaten a real serious landmass invasion of a large country, about little smaller than Texas, but huge, 43 million people. Why? This has perplexed me for a long time. So my theory on this is the biggest clue and the biggest indicator for me was July 12th of 2021, when Putin published his famous treatise that was entitled The Historical Unity of the Russians and Ukrainians. My thought, in all candor, when I saw that, I said, he's going to invade. I was convinced. I have no evidence. I have no hard intel or anything, but I said, a world leader does not make a statement like this. It's like 20 pages long and rattles off the entire history of Ukraine as though it never existed as any kind of an entity. And then you see the buildup of the forces. And to me, it just became more and more blindingly obvious he was going to invade. But why? So my other hypothesis is Putin is a man obsessed with history. He's constantly referring to many, many figures, writers, leaders, the conversion to Christianity in 988 by Vladimir I, on and on. It's remarkable. So I'm convinced that a man who just turned 70 becomes more and more focused on his legacy. And his own obsession with history, I believe, has to include, well, what's my role? Where am I going to be in the history books? Well, so I was intrigued when I first read it in 2000 when Putin decided he wanted to meet with Alexander Solzhenitsyn. Why? He's an ex-KGB officer, the very organization that hounded Solzhenitsyn out of the country, lived in Vermont for 16 years. And then he meets again with him in 2007, gives him the highest civilian award you can give to a citizen. He goes to his funeral. There are now Solzhenitsyn monuments, two of them, one in Vladivostok, one in Moscow. And I'm just wondering why. And I suddenly realized Solzhenitsyn wrote a book in 1990 called Rebuilding Russia. If you read the book, he explains how the reason the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union collapsed is they became multi-ethnic empires with all these other people who really weren't Russians. It was not the Slavic core. In the book, Solzhenitsyn makes the case that to rebuild a strong Russia, it needs to be the Slavic core, which Solzhenitsyn defines as Ukraine, but only parts. He's very careful because he himself has Ukrainian ancestors, very close. Second, Belarus. Third, northern Kazakhstan. So back to history, Ivan III, the gatherer of the Russian land, Ivan the Great. There's a statue of Ivan III that didn't exist before until the Putin era. So purely speculative on my part, I think this obsession with history explains a lot, except he made a big mistake. Geostrategically, he underestimated the Ukrainians, he greatly underestimated the West. And I think part of his calculus, and I'm sorry for going on for a long time. I also believe that Putin studied what was going on in the world and he saw a window of opportunity. The US is incredibly polarized. Our departure from Afghanistan was not one of our shining moments. He said the Americans, they're so weary of war. When you asked about it, they don't want to have another war. Do Americans care about Ukraine? Probably not. Europe, its foundations are coming apart. We have Brexit. We have rising populism. We have anti-immigrant sentiment. We have all these issues related to culture and values that Putin talked about constantly. Europe is not so strong. The Americans are not interested. I have my agenda to secure my legacy in Russian history. Maybe this is an opportune time. And he greatly underestimated Ukrainians. They're weak. They're not united. They have terrible polling data that I think they misunderstood. If you've read about the FSB conducting polls, and you probably know this better than I, but polls show that 40% of the Ukrainians said we would stand up and fight an invader. And I'm thinking, what about the other 60? What did they say? And so I wondered, did the FSB actually brief Putin? Or did they not bother to tell him? Or did they just focus on the part that said 8% or less single digits have confidence in the president of the country? Maybe and there really wasn't much support in the Rada either, that this was going to be real easy, that we'll take through this in a week or two, like I suggested Lukashenko might have said. So all the pieces were there as a window of opportunity. And certainly, I mean, the signals were pretty clear. And I think, fortunately enough, people recognize that this invasion was a real threat. And he did, but it was a huge agency. I'm sorry for the long answer.
So it's fine. Josh, you want to weigh in here?
Yeah.
There are various ways of looking at this, what you're taking on.
Sure. Thanks so much. And thanks for everyone for inviting me to be here tonight as well. And it's an honor to be sitting here with you guys and listening. So I think we've had two explanations here for why Putin may have chosen to invade Russia. So the one that was newer to me as a campaign tactic for 2024, and then the historical argument, trying to cement his legacy that Peter has very eloquently laid out here. I think there's two other potential explanations that are on the table. One of which has gotten a lot of play and one of which has gotten less play, but is actually kind of interestingly, like I think loops back a little bit to this campaign idea here. And the one that's gotten a lot more play is, one explanation is to sort of take Putin at his word, right? That he was concerned about NATO encroachment and that this is, that this is a situation where he looks at NATO gradually expanding. He feels betrayed by NATO. We can look at different points of this. There's the question about what was said around the reunification of Germany. There's Libya as a turning point, right? And the idea here is that as Ukraine keeps leaning closer and closer towards NATO, that this then is an unacceptable situation. And over time, it's only going to get worse. And so Putin makes this decision that it has to be kind of done, now is the time to cement Ukraine. And this is something he's been vocal about, perhaps not as, explicitly elegant as when he said that the collapse of the Soviet Union was the worst calamity of the 20th century. But he said in the lead up to the war that this is what he was concerned about. Of course, the irony is that there is literally nothing that could have been done to strengthen NATO more than by invading Ukraine. As Peter laid out, there were lots of reasons to suggest that NATO wasn't, that Europe was not particularly focused on this, the United States, especially under Trump, had disengaged more, Afghanistan. I would even go so far as to say, as you sort of push back on this, and in terms of the concern about having an anti-Russian Ukraine with a more pro-Western orientation, this blundering sense of mistakes of bringing about your fear, what you claim to think. This goes all the way back to 2014, right? Where what I was saying at the time about this was, right, like if you have before 2014, if you have a pro-Western government in Ukraine, what do you have to do to get a pro-Russian government? Just wait 4 years till the next election, right? The Ukrainians were voting out governments with stunning regularity. The country, as has been, very much explained, in the first 25 years of independence, neither, it was as Luke and Wei famously called it, an unconsolidated authoritarian state. It couldn't, no forces were strong enough to do this. There were balances in the country, but you had pro-Russian forces, you had pro-Western sides. And then you come along and you annex Crimea, which is like trying to say, okay, well, we want to install Republican dominance in the United States. Let's start by annexing Texas, right? And we're now going to like run elections without Texas. And so I think that to me was what happened in 2014, two things simultaneously. One is you pull out the most reliably pro-Russian bloc in the Ukrainian electorate and say, we're now going to run elections without this bloc forever. But on top of that, and this is how the political scientist Olga Onek at the University of Manchester has really done kind of incredible research on this, about showing about how this then goes and develops this Ukrainian civic identity that begins to transcend the traditional regional differences, the traditional language-based differences in the aftermath of that election. So you start with 2014, where you begin to develop this Ukrainian antipathy to Russia, and you take the most pro-Russian part out of it. And then you go into, and then you say, okay, well, we're concerned about NATO. And you go in, and what happens as a result of invading? You have a more unified NATO than we've had in forever. You have the Germans, whether they're actually doing it is a whole other matter, but you have the Germans publicly coming out, committing to vastly increase military spending, which is what the US has been trying to get Europeans to do for ages. You have incredibly lining up behind it. So, and then you get Sweden and Finland joining NATO, right? Like, so if the concern was NATO being a threat to Russia, there's literally nothing you could come up with other than just attacking NATO that would have been, would have been worse in terms of accomplishing this goal, which is the same thing that Peter makes your point about legacies, right? Which is that history is going to judge Putin very, very differently because of this war, including Russian history. Right now, he may have enough of a stranglehold over the media, over the information environment right now, that people are not going to say this was inside Russia. But 30 years from now, when people look back on Russian history, Putin, who could have really ridden into the sun in 2009 as the sort of, the person who set the post-communist Russia on its thing, but still could have ridden out into the sun in 2024 as providing over 25 years of stability and economic expansion. There's going to be a very different story written about him in Russian history on this. And I think the same thing holds for, I think he would have gotten reelected in 2024. It's still a good question about whether he will get reelected in 2024, but he certainly made it harder for himself right now. So I think all of those, I think those things are sort of crucial here. I think the other point that is worth noting here, that, my background, I come from, I study domestic politics and I study mass political behavior. And what I was also struck by in 2014 was the images, the peaceful images of Ukrainians parading through Yanukovych's palace, and the gold toilets and the ostriches and the ostentatious wealth that was only accomplished by vast scales of corruption, but peacefully, not ransacking it, not looking anything like Nazis, right? Looking calmly as this was exposed, as it was spread throughout social media. And to me, this scenario is Putin's worst nightmare, that a regime can rise up and have it not be a disaster and overthrow their kind of kleptocratic type of government that's in power here. And so I think another potential motive for Putin that is worth having on the table here is that I agree that Putin has long been fixated on Ukraine. And I think it is a very big puzzle to me why he's so fixated on Ukraine. I think Peter's explanation of history is probably the best explanation for it. But it does, as you say, cut against the grain of him being so careful about so many other things in the time that he's been in power. But one explanation, I think, post-2014 is that it has been important for Putin's hold on Russian politics for democratic experiments, democratic alternatives not to succeed, which I think explains why he is so interested in keeping Lukashenko in power, not because he particularly cares about Lukashenko, but because in the context of when we get to the post-Crimea and post the Revolution of Dignity, if Lukashenko is thrown out of power peacefully, that again is a signal to the Russians that this could happen in Russia. And I think this is, and in this sense, I think there's another thing we have to consider this idea that a success in Ukraine is a domestic political risk to Putin, even if he's wrong about this, I think it can feel like this. And so you get this sense that post 2014, there's just this desire not to make the Ukrainian experiment succeed.
Yeah, I mean, I think it resonates with alternate explanations for why states go to war. Just generally speaking, one being that countries are feeling more powerful and are irresistibly drawn into using it. The other, that great powers achieving imminent decline, see a window during which they can, they can still march on their opponents and lock in their advantages. And we go back and forth in our foreign policy theory about, which of those it is. Seems to me that the application of this to Russia and possibly also to China are two countries that have a lot of power and are very, very fearful about the long-term sustainability of their power. I'm persuaded by that. Sort of get into a conversation just for a few minutes, then I want to go to the audience about policy, U.S. policy. It matters what our explanation is for why Putin did what he did. So some of those more kind of instrumental, kind of short-term geostrategic objectives can be dealt with, not easily and not necessarily right away. They can be dealt with within a negotiating context where you can hypothetically commit ourselves and the Ukrainians never join NATO. And if that was the problem, you made an advance towards a peaceful settlement. If it's this historical, ideological kind of this fantastical idea of the restoration of the Soviet Empire, of the Tsarist Empire, whatever empire he wants to restore, it's hard to imagine anything other than a victory on the Ukrainian part to end this war. Given those inflated objectives, you don't get a peaceful settlement. You get into the war when one side or the other wins. Do you agree with that? And how would you, specifically with respect to Biden, how would you rate his performance so far in this? And do you think there'll be a moment here in the next few months when people see an opportunity to put forward a plan for negotiations?
You want to go first?
You want to start, or we should sort of go around the whole panel?
Sure. Yeah. Okay. I mean, I think you're absolutely right, Michael, that what you think is the motivation matters, right? And the first scenario that this was about NATO, right? That is, I mean, he's dug himself an incredible hole in that regard, but it is as difficult as it is to solve. It's one that you think is a solvable solution. However, I want to caution, especially because we don't have any Ukrainian colleagues on this panel tonight, that whenever you have a discussion about this, okay, can we negotiate this settlement? We have to take Ukrainian agency seriously, right? And so it's easy for Americans to sit up here and say, well, we can make a deal about Ukraine not joining NATO. But that's not actually the way NATO is set up. NATO is set up that member countries can apply, and it's up to the countries to ask if they want to join this union. And so to negotiate that away on behalf of the Ukrainians is very is something that I think we have to be very, very careful about talking about this. Now, so I'm more comfortable saying in this thing, not can Russia and the United States come to an agreement where Russia and the US says, okay, we're going to go with these two things. But is there a scenario whereby Ukrainian security guarantees, Ukraine's security can be guaranteed to the point where Ukraine is willing to sign on to a deal? Because what we have absolutely learned from this conflict is that the Ukrainians have a tremendous amount of agency here, right? Like prior to the war, I mean, Peter, you may have known they were going to invade. That's like one step higher, I think, than most people were. But I think there was also a huge feeling that if they did invade, we could have some sort of repeat of Georgia, right? And we didn't. Now, Western weapons play a huge amount in that, and arms can be twisted and everything like that in that regard. But I do think the Ukrainians have earned an important voice in this discussion. And so that makes that situation more complicated. I think it's the other two things that it's about. If it's about historical legacies, or it's about, what I had suggested, that it might also be about this kind of domestic politics, like wanting to see the Ukrainian experiment fail. I think those things point, especially the latter one, that, he wants to, if part of this is he wants to see the Ukrainian experiment fail, because he thinks that makes the Ukrainian experiment succeeding, makes his hold on power in Russia more tenuous, then the way that you end this war is you make continuing the war a greater threat to his continuing hold on power. And I think that brings us to everything Valerie said, which raised, really, really important issues here about what it is that could actually threaten Putin's hold on power. And in the aftermath of the colored revolutions, the revolution of dignity, we tend to think in terms of these mass uprisings, and Putin clearly is taking major steps to prevent that kind of mass uprising. But I think what's interesting from the person on the ground, and then the person who's, from the scholarly take on this, political scientists will tell you that more often or not, exactly what Valerie described, is that when autocrats get removed, it's because they lose the support of those around them. And I think that's where we get into some, and that's a question about, like, can you get to the point where, and maybe it's late 2023 is the time that you're talking about here, but can you get to the point where continuing the war becomes more of a threat to Putin's hold on power than allowing Ukraine to somehow succeed? And maybe there's some space in there to create some opportunity.
I think that's exactly right. Yeah.
Well, very interesting observation. I agree with what you have said about the motivation and about some security concerns from Putin about the possible Ukrainian intention to become closer to NATO. And in fact, also, I would like just to remind the auditorium that the biggest challenge towards the communist regime came not from dissidents, not from liberal opposition, but it came from inside. You probably remember that Yeltsin was the 10th most influential person in the Communist Party. He was the chairman of the Communist Party of Moscow, whatever. So just, it means that, it was not the people on the street that threatens it, but somebody from inside. So just in terms of NATO, very often we are talking about geopolitical orientation, but we forget about some very substantial thing. The geopolitical orientation is not that, for instance, I like the United States, or I like Great Britain and I dislike Russia, or I would like to be closer with this country and do not want to be close to that country. I think it's more about values. Just that similar is trying to be attached to the similar. Just if you have a democratic regime inside yourself, then you would like to find the partners whom you can speak the same language and who can share the same values. And dictators, they become close to themselves because, they understand each other better. So I think geopolitical orientation is nothing to do with some geography or, just this type of thing, or whether to be a part of this military bloc or that military bloc. It's about the values that you have inside the country. And these values, prompted you to seek a geopolitical patron or ally. Yeah, that's very important. And I think that in terms of the United States, really very interesting story, because the reason why Ukraine and many European nations also would like to be closer to the United States, and why, in fact, the US is and probably will be for just many years and many decades or even centuries from now, the only global or superpower, is that for several reasons. The first reason is that the United States is the only nation which identity is built on values, but not on ethnical principles. When you declare any ethnicity, Russian world or just Deutschland über alles or whatever, just then you make all other people feel at least very uncomfortable. But if you are talking about values, if you share the democratic values, then you can find in the United States your natural partner. The second reason is that, just if you are located in Europe, if you're Bulgaria, Romania, or any other country, you cannot consider the US as an even inferior threat, because the United States can never get a part of your territory. You can you can consider Hungarians as a threat, like Romanians, or Ukrainians versus Hungarians or Romanians, or whatever, because they share the same territory. And in terms of the United States, you can be Europe, but not any country in Europe or anywhere in the world can consider the US as a threat. It's just, moreover, when Trump started to build a border with Mexico, he just demonstrated that we do not have interest even to Mexico. So it was just a very interesting signal to the world that we do not look for any other lands, and this is also a very important thing. And finally, why we started to talk about whether China is a global power? No, just all the countries, they are looking for American investments, and this investment goes over the ocean, and Americans invest. China would never invest. China can build ports, but they would contract to their own people. They do not give an opportunity for other nations to benefit from their economic growth. I started High Tech Park, and just in 2000. When I was still here, it was Clinton administration, and it was a visit of the Prime Minister Modi of India, and and Clinton and Modi, they were talking about the new phenomena, an export of Indian software to the United States, but it's not about the export of Indian software. It's about the benefits that America brought to India. The opportunities, huge opportunities. Now it's about billions, hundreds of billions of dollars, that India benefit from it. Now Apple, in fact, opened its factory in India. So, but I tried to find how many companies, in fact, like Huawei or Xiaomi opened, R&D centers somewhere overseas. No, not at all. And from this viewpoint, the countries from all over the world, they will be looking for America to invest. And America, like, Intel, they built 2 factories now, $70 billion, one in Germany and another is Ireland. So, if you are a very distinct country, you understand that you can benefit from American growth and from American economy. And you cannot benefit from Russian, and Russia is a regional power. Once Obama told that, and Putin took an offense, But this is a reality, because maximum that you can influence is only your neighbors with the price of oil and gas. If you go to Italy or Britain or Spain or France, they don't care, about it. So because they only regionally you can influence somehow with the price of oil and gas. But the real global power is the power that can go far beyond the borders. And this is just very clear reasons, because again, nobody would consider the US as a threat. And militarily, definitely, the United States is the only country that can be present. But I'm not talking about military capabilities. I'm talking about the philosophy. That people in different parts of the world, like, listen, you cannot probably imagine that, but living in our part of the world, I just put myself to be a citizen of Kenya and thinking, look, here is a grandmother of the president of the United States. Where actually it's possible? In what country of the world it's possible? So, this is what makes America different from my viewpoint. And even China, that now has the communist ideology, the Soviet Union tried to hide it, and that was the reason why the Ukraine was built, why Kazakhstan was created, because they wanted to demonstrate that it's more about ideology, but not about national identity.
I want to.
I'm sorry.
Sorry, guys. So we'll take questions from you and also remotely. Michelle, if you have anyone online, but hands up, anyone? Yeah.
First of all, yeah, thank you all for coming out.
If you can just wait.
Oh.
Thank you all for coming out. It's been really interesting. I have a question actually about Belarus, but I think it's germane to the wider discussion here. Is it possible to start, imagining what the political characteristics of the prospective next government of Belarus are like in terms of currents within civil society today in Belarus, more nationalist or more liberal, Eastern facing or Western facing, or some hybrid or none of the above?
Veronica, we
Well, actually, yeah, thank you very much for the question. First of all, I'm not sure that the Russian people would like to have this presidency in the future, because we have had that with the Institute of Presidency. And if you look at the example of EU countries, with a very few exceptions, most of the prosperous and democratic countries, I'm not talking about the United States, but mostly it's like parliamentary republics. So parliamentary republics. So we believe, first of all, we need
Parliamentary democracy, because they can be monarchies, but just still it's parliament.
Therefore, we believe that we need to talk to our people first, because I'm not sure that the people of Belarus would support the Institute of Presidency. But at the same time, we need to educate our people. What is the differences between parliamentary democracies, presidential republics, or mixed republics? Because for the last 28 years, we were ruled by one person, and for 28 years we didn't get a chance to even vote for the people to parliament, leader parliament, president, etc. So we're not used to these democratic principles, which, as I said, are normal in the rest of the world. That's why we need to decide what kind of parliamentary or presidential republic we're going to have, and then based on the choice of the people to conduct elections.
Thank you. And I would like to add one thing. Again, the internal structure of Belarus society will predetermine its geopolitical orientation, if I rightly understood your question. First of all, we have to become a democracy, and then I think it will be quite natural, whom to build good relations with.
Thank you very much for your design. I want to ask a question related to today's elections in the United States, but broaden it a bit. To what extent do you think Putin is counting on the results of these midterm elections here, as well as other factors that are just coming into play from a seasonal perspective, such as the winter season in Europe and energy problems and that sort of thing, increasing domestic pressure and polarization in the United States and some European countries? To what extent is he counting on that to help him in his battle against Ukraine?
Sure. It's a great question. I think it's a very big part of the strategy right now. I think in light of the poor performance of the Russian military and the fact that they're kind of stalemated now and actually on the defensive, I think the biggest part of the strategy right now is he considers winter as one of his greatest assets. The fact that we had this deal with the Saudis to reduce production by 2 million barrels a day was another key part of that, because he's counting in part on public opinion and public reactions in the US and Europe, high prices. We're already very, very clearly from parties across Europe and also in the United States. How long are we going to finance Ukraine's war? We have a lot of our own domestic issues. Am I going to pay $5 a gallon in gas? There was a wonderful political cartoon recently in the Washington Post. And there's a guy driving a truck going up gas, and he says, I voted for the fascists, how come the gas prices are so high? Which I thought was utterly depressing, but I think Putin absolutely has finger on the pulse of Western publics. So that's a big part of it. And I also think that these pretty direct threats about possible use of nuclear weapons, which he has never disavowed. The problem with Putin is he says a lot and then frequently does exactly what he says he wasn't going to do. So I think throwing out that threat periodically is another part of his strategy to intimidate people, thinking we need to pressure Zelensky somehow. We don't want to have that scenario come about. So between the energy prices, the winter, and the pressure, and perhaps the punitive measures taken against Ukrainian civilians. If you've been reading recently about the power outages, they decided to really pull the plug on energy in Kyiv for real. And I've read accounts that there are contingency plans to remove 3 million people out of Kyiv. Where are they going to go? Which is another form of the pressure too, in terms of the Europeans and the influx of refugees. So he may believe time is on his side, but on the other hand, on the military side, it hasn't been going so well. So that's the balance. But winter, again, I think may put us in kind of a freeze, if you will, on the military front. And he may be hoping that in 3 or 4 months, he's going to have other pressures working to support his war. To get some kind of negotiated process, or at least a ceasefire.
Yeah, just to make one tiny point. I mean, we had a longish discussion about what may have motivated Putin to begin in this war, but regardless of his motivations, his political future is better served by winning it. You know, whether you think he wants legacy, whether you think he wants negotiations against NATO, you think he wants domestic politics. So we can come from a lot of different places about why he may have started it. And I do think those have different implications for how it might end, but I think they all kind of converge to the same place in terms of his short-term goal of succeeding on the battlefield. And we haven't had any time tonight to get into, you know, what were issues with the Russian military, why there's impediments and not guns, well, that's a whole other set of conversations here. But I think your point about the strategy is exactly right. Like he's trying to wait out to see if a bunch of things are going to happen. And actually, and the public opinion numbers I've seen, you know, among Republicans is a little bit depressing, right? Like Republicans have gone from being staunch supporters of the Ukrainians to less staunch supporters of the Ukrainians. And so we'll see, you know, we will see what happens tonight. You know, my guess is there are still enough Republicans in the Senate, in the House, who will be able to vote to sustain this kind of support in conjunction with the Democrats. But as we get closer to the presidential election, falling in line becomes a bigger deal. And, you know, so I think these are real concerns. On the other hand, I think Putin has throughout this entire conflict radically underestimated the willingness of Europeans to stand together and to bear pain. And if you had told us before this happened, right, that you know, gas prices would have gone up as much as they had in Europe, and with the European leadership would all be standing, you know, still resolutely. So I think from Europe's perspective, they've already done a lot of the hard part. Like they've just got to get through this winter, and there's been a lot of action in terms of liquefied natural gas and securing supports. And if they make it through this winter, man, this again, to Putin's strategic miscalculation, he will have played an energy card that the Soviets never played during the entire Cold War. He will have burned his sense as a reliable supplier to Europe. And this is going to be not just long-term, a real medium-term problem, because being dependent on the Chinese as your, you know, major customer is not where Russia wants to be long-term. So I think like there is this short-term thing that this is strategically advantageous, but if the Europeans make it through this summer and they can really cut off from energy dependence on Russia, that really flips the sort of, that was his major weapon against the Europeans, and he will have shot it and it will have not succeeded.
Yeah, and on top of that, I would like just to add that probably Putin really has in mind to undermine the unity between the Western countries, and also finding some groups of people that were affected, that are affected most from these energy prices. However, the problem is, and he really wants the West would start to pressure Zelensky to concede. The only problem is that Zelensky is not a person who decides in this situation. He's not the classical way of the president, I think, that we all got used to, and he's far, far from being a guy who can make decisions the same way as Putin can make it in Russia. So it's just a national consensus, and I personally believe that if Zelensky would enter negotiations, he would be physically removed immediately by the people of Ukraine. And and I can see each of them has their own role. And this is the strength, in fact, of the Ukraine army also, because everyone is responsible on its own position. And whether Russians have a vertical way of running the military, Ukrainians, they are very disintegrated, they work in small units, and everyone have responsibility on themselves without consulting with a bigger boss. And even the decision whether to give up to these Azov guys on Azov style or not, Zelensky could make this decision. He completely relies on the initiative of the people on the ground. And he said that, look, it's up to you whether you give up or just continue fight. We will support you anyway, and so on and so forth. So the only way for him to act is to stay in Kyiv and to encourage with his statement every day and communicate with the West. Everything else is not in his hands. And that's, just the biggest miscalculation. What Poroshenko could do, Zelensky cannot do that. And, that's a big difference. And in fact, we saw the Russian support of this war in the beginning, the public opinion, if it was, but, we called it the military sofa military, the people that live, that sit on the sofa and, and stand for the war against Ukraine. But what is in reality, we saw that when Russia attacked, the first 3-4 days, they were a long line of volunteers, that wanted to take arms in their hands and go to fight. When Putin launched the conscription to the army, 350,000 ran away from the country, and altogether, it's just different calculations, but a little bit less than 1.5 million young men, they just simply disappeared from the business in Russia, from private business. They went to dachas, to to rural areas. They switched off the phones, and they took the voluntarily vacation, and they don't want to show up. And this is a real public support for the Putin aggression.
I think we can squeeze in one more question, at least one more. Chris?
Great. Thanks very much for that. I just have a question for everybody, if they could ask, maybe answer it from their own perspective. What's worse than the outcome of this? A strong Russia or a weak Russia?
Question, what's worse?
What's better, either way.
Both. Strong Russia can be only, just when they will change the course. Isolated Russia cannot be strong Russia. When they lost the war to Japan, they became strong, after they started modernization, and that's the answer.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
This is really, really helpful, and appreciate everyone's perspective. I guess one of the questions I have is, how does Russia get out of this without, say, being deemed as weaker on some type of level playing field? Like, how to put it back out of this? And I guess the U.S.'s strategy, I'm assuming, is not just binary in this Russian-Ukraine situation, but also kind of telling or representative of how they may handle a Taiwan-China incident, an Iran and Middle East incident, an North Korea-South Korea incident. So how do you think that calculus and how they're treating this Ukraine-Russia situation is kind of, I guess, gesturing how they treat another like situation?
So let me give each of you a minute to answer the question, how does this end? Considering all the conflicting interests involved, Ukrainian, we have an agency, as you pointed out, the United States, which wants to diminish Russian power, and Putin and Russia that has these, imperial fantasies. What is the end game?
Well, I mean, I'll answer the question you asked, which is about Russia. How does Russia get out of this without looking weaker? I don't think it does. I mean, I think the Russian army, which went into this as the second most feared military force in the world, is no longer going to have that status. And so, if you want to be terrified and stay up late at night, you think that pushes Putin, knowing that he can only come out looking weak, to do something really, really dramatic. But as we've seen in the last few weeks, there seems to be sort of stepping back from those types of things. But I don't think there's any way they get out of this without looking weak. It's just a question of, do they get out of this without regime change or with regime change? And I think that is a very, and the question before about what's worse, a strong Russia or a weak Russia? I think it's sort of, there's an orthogonal question there, which is is it a Russia with Putin still in charge, or is it a Russia without Putin in charge? And we would need a whole other hour and a half to talk about what the without Putin in charge looks like. I'm sure we all have ideas about that. But I don't think we get out without it looking weaker right now, because the shortcomings in the Russian armed forces have been exposed for the world to see. And Russia is it is just clear that it is not a military that looks anything like the strength of the Chinese military, for just to give my example, but probably lots of other militaries too. And I think Russia's going to have to take some time to rebuild to get back to that point of being thought of. But if you think that the reason the Russian military was so weak was because of the entire kind of political economy system that built up under Putin, this kind of kleptocratic, Henry Hale calls it a patronalistic system, based on patronage, then it's unclear how Russia gets strong without changing the system that it has that Putin built so painstakingly over the last 20 years.
Just quickly,
There is no face-saving formula for Putin and for Russia. But they can declare that they achieved their major results, that they demilitarized Ukraine, they made Ukraine weak, they destroyed its power stations and infrastructure. So they may declare that that was the original idea of this operation they achieved, and they can declare that they achieved the major results, and then return back to the territories, at least of the February 20th.
It's the Khrushchev-Cuban Missile Crisis model, right? That you give him just enough to allow him to claim victory. That's his off-ramp. Of course, Khrushchev lost his job about a year later. The same thing will happen to Putin under those circumstances.
But just as a hunter that went for hunting, and he was asked whether he killed any animal, he said, "No, I didn't, but one rabbit I scared to death."
But by the way, I think, Chris, in terms of how people in Washington think about this, my guess is that as this war continues, that there will be a point when we or the administration prefers a weak Putin to whoever might possibly succeed him. The best of all scenarios in a war that really doesn't have a clear winner is a Putin that's been chastened by the experience, as opposed to the uncertainties associated with his opponents taking over, who might very well be worse than Putin himself. You want to?
No, I agree with everything for what has been said already, but my point is, I don't think that Russia is going to win in Ukraine, because the Ukrainians, they have their purpose this spell. For Russia, there is no purpose. Russian soldiers, they don't understand what they're doing in Ukraine. Ukrainians, they fight for their land, they fight for their families, they fight for their future. Russians, they're completely lost. I mean, they don't understand what the purpose of their, invasion into Ukraine. That's why I firmly believe that Russia is going to lose this war, Ukrainians will win because they know what they're fighting.
Thank you. You want to wrap it up?
I mean, I agree with everything I just heard. But somebody has to be the devil's advocate, which is a role I used to play often. But I worry, and Josh, you hinted at this, if Putin sees that he actually is not even close to getting anything out of this deal, I worry about that he will actually consider these horrifying options. Will he actually do it? I mean, who can know? I do agree completely. I think Russia's weaker. I think Putin has sold their future geostrategically for decades. He lost one of his most important markets for the key energy supply in Europe. And energy sales, as you all know, is 40 to 45% of the Russian budget. Now his main market is going to be China and India. And I guess the Chinese are getting a pretty good price. Yeah, they're in a very good bargaining position. He's terribly weak at it. The other possible scenario that, again, just looking at the horrible possible scenarios, a new leader comes in who's reform-minded and says, we have the worst army in the world. We need to fix that. We need to change our military strategy. We need to do what Valerie just said. We need a bottom-up, lots of local initiatives, not this crazy top-down system. And we need to rebuild our military. And now maybe that's going to be a moderate, more democratic minded Russia, but somebody in there is going to say we need a real army. We don't fight nuclear wars, we fight conventional wars.
Do you believe Russians are going to use the nuke?
I don't think so, but I definitely don't rule out the possibility. I do believe Putin is so upset. He's got to have something to show for this, because ultimately it's about losing power. And I totally agree here. I think his biggest fear now is I can get thrown out. I have to have everybody close to me, and they all bear responsibility. The Security Council meeting.
And you think that pushes into an escalation and that's what's cutting?
Yeah, I guess I'm more to the escalation part, and what form that takes. You can debate. More massive punitive strikes, taking out the power grid. We haven't talked about threats to the West, but I didn't mention cyber, but I also think that's definitely part of the toolkit. That would be that DDoS attack on U.S. airports. They say that came out of Russia. And think about that. A big strike that takes out your ATMs for a couple of weeks or something.
Okay, well, not a very optimistic conclusion, but that's the virtual reality is that, that's what you got to face. So thank you, everyone, for all this time and all the insights. Very interesting, very exciting. And thanks to you guys for getting this going.
Thank you.
Thank you.